You've met this person, maybe more than once. They talk with complete confidence about things they barely understand. They give advice on topics they've barely touched. They argue with experts and don't feel even slightly outmatched. And the most baffling part, they genuinely believe every word they're saying. What you're watching is not arrogance exactly. It's not lying either. It's something far more interesting and far more uncomfortable, because this person isn't exaggerating what they know. They genuinely don't know how little they know. And that distinction is everything. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. And it's one of the most widely discussed, most widely misunderstood, and honestly most important psychological concepts that exists, because it doesn't just explain that person you know. It explains something about all of us, at certain points in our lives, in certain areas of our knowledge, whether we want to admit it or not. In this video, we're going to look at exactly where this effect comes from, including the genuinely strange story of the man who inspired the original research. We're going to walk through the 4 stages of the curve, what most people get completely wrong when they talk about this, where it shows up in real life in ways you might not expect, and the question most videos on this topic avoid entirely, how to know if you're experiencing it yourself right now. Because that last part is the one that actually changes anything. Understanding this effect intellectually is easy. Recognizing it in yourself is the thing that's genuinely hard and genuinely useful. Let's start at the very beginning, with a bank robber. Stay with me. In 1995, a man named MacArthur Wheeler robbed 2 banks in Pittsburgh in broad daylight. He made no attempt to hide his face, no mask, no disguise. He walked in, robbed the banks, and walked out again, in full view of multiple security cameras, looking directly into them without any concern at all. He was arrested that same evening. When police showed him the footage that clearly showed his undisguised face walking into both banks, Wheeler was stunned, genuinely, completely stunned. He looked at the screen and reportedly said something like, "But I wore the juice." He had rubbed lemon juice on his face before committing the robberies. He had apparently heard somewhere that lemon juice can be used as invisible ink, and he concluded from this that if he put lemon juice on his face, cameras simply wouldn't be able to see him. He had tested it with a Polaroid camera before leaving the house. It hadn't worked, but he assumed the camera must be broken. When psychologist David Dunning read about this case in a newspaper, he wasn't just amused by it. He became genuinely fascinated by the psychology behind it, because Wheeler wasn't just stupid, he was confidently wrong. He had a system, he had tested it, he had reasoned it through, and the problem wasn't just that he was wrong, it was that he had no awareness whatsoever that he might be wrong. Dunning brought his student Justin Kruger into the research. Together, they designed a set of experiments to answer one simple but profound question. Do people with limited knowledge actually know how limited they are? The answer, it turned out, was a very firm no, and the paper they published in 1999 went on to become one of the most cited in the history of psychology. They tested people on logical reasoning, grammar, and a sense of humor, things that have objectively measurable right and wrong answers. They asked each person 2 questions. First, how well did you actually do? Second, how did you think you did compared to everyone else? The results were striking. The people who scored in the bottom quarter, the lowest performers, didn't just overestimate their own performance a little. They dramatically overestimated it. They placed themselves, on average, in the top half. They thought they were above average when they were actually near the bottom. And the gap between where they thought they were and where they actually were was far bigger than for anyone else in the study. So why does this happen? The answer is more interesting than you might expect. It's not just about being careless or lazy or arrogant. It actually comes down to a very specific and very understandable problem with how knowledge itself works. To recognize that your work is poor, you need the same skills required to make the work good in the first place. Think about that for a second. If you don't know enough about logic to reason correctly, you also don't know enough about logic to recognize that your reasoning is wrong. The skill needed to evaluate yourself is the same skill you're being evaluated on, and if you don't have it, you can't see the gap. This is sometimes described as a problem of metacognition, your ability to think about your own thinking. When that metacognitive ability is limited, you essentially can't look at your own performance from the outside. You can only see it from inside your own knowledge, which feels perfectly complete from where you're standing, because you don't know what's beyond the edges of it. Here's a simple way to think about it. Imagine you've only ever seen your own small town. To you, it feels like you know a lot about how the world is laid out. Roads, buildings, neighborhoods. You feel quite competent about geography. Then someone shows you a satellite image of the entire planet, and suddenly your town is invisible. You didn't know how much you didn't know because you had never seen the scale of what you were missing. That's the Dunning-Kruger problem in plain terms. It's not that incompetent people are deluded about a reality they can see. It's that they genuinely, sincerely don't have access to the reference point they'd need to realize they're wrong. The problem is invisible to them by nature, because seeing it would require exactly the knowledge they don't yet have. Dunning himself put it beautifully. He said something like, "The first rule of the Dunning-Kruger Club is that you don't know you're a member of the Dunning-Kruger Club. The awareness that you might be overconfident is itself a form of expertise, which means the less you know, the less likely you are to suspect it." And here is where it gets really interesting, because the same research also found something unexpected about experts. People who scored at the very top of the tests also got something wrong. They consistently underestimated how good they were. They assumed that because the task felt easy to them, it probably felt easy to most other people too. Which brings us to the full curve. The experts had what we might call the opposite problem. They were so good that difficulty had become invisible to them. They'd forgotten what it felt like not to know, and so they couldn't accurately imagine how hard it still was for everyone else. Confidence and competence were misaligned at both ends of the scale, just in opposite directions. Let's walk through the 4 stages that most people go through as they learn any new skill or enter any new field. You will almost certainly recognize yourself somewhere on this curve, probably in more than one place, depending on the area of your life you're thinking about. Stage 1, the peak of Mount Stupid. You learn the basics of something new. You pick up the fundamentals, maybe in an afternoon or a week, and suddenly everything seems to make sense. You feel like you get it. You feel actually like you might be pretty naturally talented at this. You feel confident. You feel ready to explain it to other people. This is the top of the curve, the highest point of confidence relative to actual skill, and it has a wonderfully accurate nickname. Researchers sometimes call it Mount Stupid. Stage 2, the Valley of Despair. Then you keep going. You encounter complexity you didn't know existed. You try something harder and it doesn't work the way you expected. You meet someone who actually knows this field deeply, and you suddenly realize how much you don't know. The confidence crashes, hard and fast. You go from feeling brilliant to feeling completely out of your depth, sometimes overnight. This is the Valley of Despair, the lowest point on the confidence curve, and it's where a lot of people quit. This is actually a critical turning point. People who push through the Valley of Despair, who don't quit when their initial confidence collapses, are the ones who eventually develop real competence. The discomfort of this stage is not a sign that you're bad at the thing. It's actually a sign that you're starting to understand it properly, because you can now see the gap between where you are and where you need to be. Stage 3, the slope of enlightenment. You keep practicing, you keep learning. Things start to click, but more slowly and more humbly this time. You get better, but you also get more aware of how much further there is to go. Your confidence starts to rebuild, but it's a different kind of confidence this time, grounded in actual experience rather than the naive certainty of someone who's just read the introduction. This is the long, slow, valuable middle part of learning anything real. Stage 4, the plateau of sustainability. Eventually, if you stick with it long enough, you reach real expertise. And here's what's interesting about this stage. Your confidence never gets back to the peak of stage 1, not because you're less capable, because you now understand the topic well enough to know how complex it really is. The more you know, the more you understand what you don't know. Genuine expertise, it turns out, comes with a certain permanent humility built right into it. This is exactly why the wisest people you've ever met often seem the least certain. It's not insecurity, it's accuracy. They've been around the field long enough to know that the questions keep getting harder the deeper you go, and that anyone who sounds completely certain about almost anything probably hasn't gone very deep at all. There's a quote often attributed to Socrates: "I know that I know nothing." Whether he actually said it or not, it captures stage 4 perfectly. The most dangerous place on the entire curve isn't stage 4, it's stage 1, where you know just enough to feel completely certain, and not yet enough to realize why that certainty is a problem. Now I want to pause here and address something important, because the Dunning-Kruger effect is one of the most talked about ideas on the internet, and most of the things people say about it are actually wrong, or at best, oversimplified. And it would be strange to do a video about a bias in how people understand their own knowledge, and then present that very knowledge in a misleading way. Misconception 1. The Dunning-Kruger effect is not the same as saying stupid people think they're geniuses. That's not what the original research showed. The original research showed that people with below average performance in a specific skill overestimate their performance in that skill. That's very different from a blanket statement about intelligence. Everyone is below average at something, including experts in their own fields. Misconception 2. This effect doesn't only apply to other people. One of the most uncomfortable truths about the Dunning-Kruger effect is that it applies to everyone, including you, in the areas where your knowledge is limited. The researchers themselves were very clear about this. This is a universal human cognitive pattern, not a permanent characteristic of a specific type of person. The question is not, does this apply to me? It's, where does this apply to me right now? Misconception. 3. Knowing about this effect doesn't protect you from it. This is perhaps the most humbling thing to accept. Simply being aware of the Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't make you immune. In fact, there's a slightly dark irony here. People who have just learned about the Dunning-Kruger effect sometimes feel like they can now clearly identify it in everyone around them, which is itself a form of overconfident pattern recognition that the researchers warned about. Misconception 4. Later research actually complicated the original findings significantly. A 2020 analysis by researcher Gilles Gignac and others found that while the pattern Dunning and Kruger identified is real, it's smaller and more nuanced than the popular version suggests. Not everyone overestimates dramatically. The effect varies considerably by domain, by individual, and by how the question is asked. The core insight is real, but the simplified internet version is oversimplified, which is fitting in a way. So what is the takeaway, given all of this nuance? The effect is real, the insight is valuable. The oversimplified version that most people know and use. That overconfident person is clearly suffering from Dunning-Kruger, is exactly the kind of breezy, confident, shallow application of partial knowledge that the effect is literally warning you about. Use it as a mirror, not a magnifying glass. Turn it toward yourself first. That's when it actually becomes useful. Now let's bring this into real life. Where is this actually showing up? In ways that genuinely affect you. Workplaces. Research consistently shows that incompetent employees are often the least likely to recognize their own incompetence, and crucially, the most likely to feel confident enough to seek promotion. Meanwhile, highly competent employees tend to underestimate themselves and hold back. The result is that confidence, not competence, often drives career advancement, especially in environments without clear, measurable feedback on actual performance. Politics and leadership. Political psychology research has found that the people most eager to lead, most confident in their judgment, and most certain of their solutions, are not always the best equipped to lead. The certainty itself can be a warning sign. People who have genuinely wrestled with complex issues tend to be more aware of their complexity. People who haven't wrestled with them yet tend to see simple solutions, and simple solutions to complex problems are rarely right. Social media and online discourse. The internet has made stage 1, the peak of initial confidence, particularly loud and particularly visible. Someone reads 3 articles about nutrition, economics, medicine, or geopolitics, and feels completely equipped to debate experts in the comments section. This isn't a character flaw specific to a certain type of person. It's a natural cognitive state that the internet makes extremely visible because it gives everyone a megaphone at exactly the moment their confidence is at its highest and their actual knowledge is at its shallowest. Health decisions. This one has real consequences. People who do brief online research about medical symptoms or treatments often emerge feeling more confident in their self-diagnosis than their doctor's opinion. Not because they've learned more, but because they've hit stage 1, where partial knowledge feels complete. This isn't stupidity, it's a cognitive pattern applied in a high-stakes situation, personal relationships. This is perhaps where it shows up most quietly and most harmfully. People who've read one book on relationships, one article on attachment theory, or who've been through one therapy session, sometimes arrive at the conclusion that they now understand themselves and their patterns completely, and from that confident position, they stop looking. They stop questioning. The learning ends just when it was getting genuinely useful. Real self-knowledge, like any expertise, gets more complex and more surprising the deeper you go. In all of these areas, the pattern is the same. The most dangerous moment isn't ignorance. It's the moment that partial knowledge mistakes itself for complete knowledge. That's when learning stops. That's when mistakes start to look like correct decisions. And that's where the Dunning-Kruger curve does its real damage. The remedy isn't knowing everything. The remedy is staying curious, even when you feel like you already know. Okay, here's the question. Most videos about this topic avoid, not do you know someone who has Dunning-Kruger, but do you have it right now, somewhere in your life? And if so, where? There are a few practical questions you can ask yourself, not to feel bad about your answers, but to actually locate yourself on the curve in areas where it matters to you personally. Question 1. When did you last change your mind about this? If you can't remember the last time your thinking on a topic genuinely shifted, that's worth noticing. Not because you're wrong, but because real expertise always produces revision. If your views on something have been static for a long time, ask whether that's because the evidence genuinely points one way, or because you stopped actively looking. Question 2. How do you feel when someone knows more than you about this? Do you feel threatened and dismiss them, or curious and interested? People in stage 1 tend to feel defensive when challenged, because their confidence doesn't have the depth to absorb new information easily. People in later stages tend to feel genuinely interested, because they're used to being wrong, and they've learned that being wrong is how the learning actually works. Question 3. Can you explain the opposing view clearly and fairly? Not as a straw man, not as a simplified caricature, but actually charitably, in a way the person who holds it would recognize as accurate. If you can't do that, you probably know only your own side of the topic, which means you're likely closer to stage 1 than stage 4, regardless of how confident you feel. Question 4. How comfortable are you saying, "I don't know"? 3 words, remarkably hard for a lot of people to say. But research shows consistently that the experts, the genuine stage 4 people, say these words more freely than anyone else. "I don't know" is not an admission of failure. It's the sound of someone who knows enough to know the limits of what they know. If saying "I don't know" feels uncomfortable, or risky, or like a sign of weakness, that discomfort is telling you something about where you are on the curve. Not as a judgment, as useful information. So let's finish with the practical part. Not how do you deal with other people who have this, but how do you actually move yourself further along the curve, in the areas where it matters to you. First, actively seek out people who know more than you do about the things that matter to you, not to compare yourself to them, not to feel small, but because proximity to genuine expertise is the single fastest way to move out of stage 1. The moment you encounter someone who really knows something, the edges of your own knowledge become visible, and visibility is the beginning of growth. Second, keep a record of times you were wrong, genuinely wrong, not just slightly off. A physical or digital log of moments when you were confident about something that turned out to be incorrect. This is deeply uncomfortable at first, but it does 2 things. It makes you more calibrated about your own certainty over time. And it shows you, over months and years, that being wrong repeatedly is not a character flaw. It's how thinking improves. Third, deliberately choose the harder version of things you think you understand. If you feel confident about a topic, find the most challenging text on it, the most rigorous opposing argument, the most expert-level discussion. Not to be hard on yourself, but because stage 1 confidence can only survive in the shallows. Take it deeper, and you'll find out pretty quickly whether your confidence is grounded or premature. Fourth, practice listening to understand, not listening to respond. In most conversations, most people are preparing their next point while the other person is still speaking. Try deliberately to wait until someone has fully finished a thought before you decide what you think of it. You'll be surprised how often the end of someone's sentence changes what you thought the beginning meant, and how many arguments you've been preparing your response to didn't actually need one. And finally, be patient with the valley of despair. If you're currently in a period of deep uncertainty about something you used to feel confident about, that's not regression. That's stage 2. That's the curve doing exactly what it's supposed to do. The crash in confidence that comes with encountering real complexity is the first sign of genuine learning. It doesn't feel like it. It often feels like failure. But it's not. It's the valley, and the valley always has the other side. The wisest thing you can ever say about almost anything is simply, I am still learning. Not because it sounds humble, because it's true, and because the alternative, deciding you've already learned enough, is the very beginning of the peak of Mount Stupid at any age about anything. Your mind is always working, even when it's convinced it already has the answer. Stay aware. If this made you think about somewhere in your own life where you might be closer to stage 1 than you realized, that's exactly the point. Cognitive biases like this one show up everywhere. If you want to go deeper, the confirmation bias video is the perfect next watch, because it shows you the other way your brain protects the beliefs you already hold. It's linked on screen right now. Stay aware.